Well, they still might now try to break out toward a nuke, in which case the logic is that the problem isn't solved yet. I would expect for the population and the political establishment inside Iran to be more radicalized and more defiant.
So recently, Scott Horton was on the Breaking Points podcast and talked about how the recent U.S. strike against Iran is ultimately proving to be a failure, how the mission wasn't accomplished according to what the Trump administration said it would, what are the implications for the future, and why this conflict isn't likely to be over anytime soon. Now, fairness and disclosure here, I know Scott, he's a friend of mine, we converse sometimes, and he's always great on these issues, one of the best actually. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
What do you make of the battle over the intelligence assessment of how badly damaged these nuclear facilities ultimately were?
Yeah, well, you know what? Not in a real benefit of the doubt sense, but just my feeling is I think Trump is probably right that the damage was, what they were hoping to get. And part of that is just because I know of the precision, their ability that they've had for many years to be able to drop a missile right down a chimney, fly it in a window. It's been this way since Iraq War I. And for them to drop a dozen or more, 14, I guess it was, they said, a 30,000 pound shape charge. These charges are meant to blast straight down, and they're 30,000 pounds, and then they drop them over and over and over down the same few holes. I imagine they can get quite a bit of damage done down there. And now their question was whether they had destroyed, all the buried centrifuge facilities and so forth. I'm really not sure about that, obviously. But, Seymour Hersh had a thing where his sources are telling him that they actually didn't think that they could reach all the centrifuge facilities down there. And that wasn't what they were trying to do. Instead, they decided that they would just essentially hit every entrance and every air shaft and every tunnel available and to just seal the place off. Anybody down there be buried alive and no one on the surface ever be able to get down there again.
Yeah, I think that's right. I haven't read Seymour Hersh's piece and I need to do that, but I think Scott's right about the damage that was done. It seems to be considerable damage to all three facilities that were bombed. However, that doesn't address whether all the uranium is buried down there beneath that rubble, because a lot of indications seem to be that at least at Fordo, a large motorcade arrived several weeks beforehand and got the uranium out. Now, could they have gotten all the centrifuges and all the cascades out? I don't know. That isn't really my expertise. Mearsheimer doubts that they could have gotten out a lot of the cascades because they're not easy to move, but the enriched uranium probably was. So it's likely that they got a lot of that out. They've had 7 years of preparation since the JCPOA was shredded by the first Trump administration to prepare for such a thing, knowing that, Israel and the United States was antagonistic against them. But he's likely correct about the damage and sealing it off and putting it under rubble. Now, whether they got the uranium out is another question. And I think there's unlimited will now to probably develop a nuke. Why wouldn't there at this point?
And the one option would be that they would be able to do, a major mine shaft type operation like they did this rescue mission that he refers to years ago, I think in Peru or South Africa or something, where these guys were buried very deep down for a very long time. And they did get down there. But then we could bomb them when they're in the middle of trying. That would essentially be the threat, right? So that sounds at least credible to me, that they know what they're doing. We're talking about the U.S. Air Force. Can they put firepower on a target and collapse the tunnel? Sure they can. So, and then they did virtually, I believe, destroy everything of real value at Isfahan, which is where they had the conversion facilities where you take the uranium ore, turn it to yellow cake, and then refine that or convert that, as they call it, to uranium hexafluoride gas, which you need to enrich up to higher and higher percentages of U-235. Then you have to convert it back into metal again. And they apparently destroyed all of that. And then, by the way, so there's this guy, David Albright, has a group called ISIS, which he called it that before the Islamic State, guys. And he's kind of a very pro-Israel simp. I don't really like him, but I do respect his technical expertise. And his group has put out a pretty thorough report from commercial satellite pictures that they got, where they run through Fordo, Isfahan, Natanz and a couple others. Apparently, there's been severe damage done at Natanz as well. And I think Trump's crowing because the Air Force is telling him we did it. And and by the way, this is announced yesterday that they're going to have talks next week. And it seems like Trump's position is going to be, look, man, I destroyed virtually your entire program. No point in rebuilding it because I'll just bomb it again. So just don't. And then, as he put it yesterday, I don't even think we need a new nuclear deal. We're just going to go on. They're just going to not have a nuclear program anymore.
I think that's a mistake, man. They clearly got a lot of that uranium out, and we want to normalize relations with Iran. At least I do, as an American taxpayer, as an anti-war activist, as a dissident. I want another JCPOA to normalize relations with Iran. And to rely on this as if this dismantled the program, despite all the journalism to the contrary of, the movement of uranium, I think is a big mistake. But if I'm Iran, I'm certainly not going to the negotiating table with the U.S. again. So, yeah, again, I think Scott's right about the damage that was done. Few people question, I think, the damage that was done. The only questions that remain amongst journalists that are actually prodding Trump on this is whether that uranium got out of there. And, whenever Hegseth and Trump are facing those questions, they talk about how skillful the U.S. military was. And no one was questioning that part of it. And they say, how deeply buried under rubble those facilities are. And no one was questioning how deeply buried under the rubble those facilities are. So I think that's where we're at right now.
And I'm not really sure about that. The Ayatollah obviously has a huge incentive to be defiant, as he was in that speech. There's probably a likelihood that it's true, as they bragged, that they already have another secret facility up and running.
Right.
And that could be Iranian propaganda. We don't know, but it sure seems like they got some of the uranium out of there at Fordo with the satellite imagery that shows that.
Or at least they're working on getting it. And I've been warning all along, I'd be happy to be wrong about this. I don't care. But the anti-war forces in America have warned all along that the threat, of course, is that if we attack them, then they'll make a nuke. Whereas this whole time they had acquired essentially a latent deterrent instead of going as far as having an actual nuclear weapon. So flip a coin. I guess we'll see how it works out.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point. They had kind of a false deterrent in the manifestation of 60% enriched uranium before, and now they very likely will get a nuclear weapon, and there'll be another nuclear power in the Middle East. By the way, the only one that exists is Israel. They have a secret nuclear program that they don't want to admit to, lest they be actually subject to IAEA restrictions and such. So they get a special exemption that no one else in the entire world gets, apparently, for having these nukes. And by the way, stealing them essentially from the United States. JFK tried to stop that in the early 60s. There's lots of correspondence between him and Ben-Gurion, and correspondence between the operators of the Domina facility that was operating this in the 1960s. And, we just pretend that didn't happen and that he didn't die in, mysterious circumstances thereafter. So that's where we're at.
So that's the thing, Scott. Everybody's trying to parse this language, and if you really do look at it precisely, like for example, we can put the next one up there. This is from the CIA director. The CIA director, John Ratcliffe, released a statement. CIA can confirm a body of credible intelligence indicates Iran's nuclear program has, quote, been severely damaged by the recent targeted strikes. This includes new intelligence, etc. But the word severely damaged is what really struck out to me, because look, I know that Trump and the politicians are rhetorically, but obliteration to me means basically non-existent, whereas severely damaged is more in the realm of, well, it's technically repairable, especially when you pile on top the secret facilities, like you said. I also do believe that there's a lot of intra-governmental leaking going on, because what's the incentive of somebody leaking saying that the strike wasn't all that credible? Well, we got to go back and we got to go to do it again, right? And so then there's a lot of politicization here of the intelligence as well. So parsing those two things, you still think, like you said, that secret facility is technically a possibility, but it may not necessarily be months as that initial assessment said.
Yeah, man, there's so much that we just don't know yet. But and I think the most important variable in it all is the Ayatollah's reaction. Either we just made him mad, and now, and plus all the guys around him too, they're all just going to be demanding, further, nuclear development. We'll just build a new Isfahan. We'll just
I would, if I'm an Iranian nationalist, I would say get the nuke right now. Fast track it. Don't go back to the negotiating table with the United States. They're duplicitous. They'll backstab you. They'll choose Israel's side over yours every single time, even if it means undermining their own foreign policy objectives. That's exactly right. Scott's right.
Build a new Natanz. We'll just do whatever we have to do to keep going. Or is it the case that, hey, the United States of America called his bluff, and ultimately their latent nuclear deterrent wasn't enough to stop us, and their mid-range missile deterrent wasn't enough, and they didn't dare, right? They shot, and this is such an important point too. This is the madman Ayatollah who only wants to bring on the apocalypse. He's willing to lose his whole nation in a first strike against Israel. They've told us for 25 years here or something like that. But now he did the same thing that Trump did after he killed Soleimani. And previous to that, in the summer of 19, when they had their back and forth over Kataib al-Hezbollah in Iraq, which is a Shiite militia backed by Iran there, and back and forth between them and Americans. They shot down the drone, I believe it was in the summer of 19. And then it was after Soleimani in the beginning of 20, they bombed the empty corner of an American base in Iraqi Kurdistan, which did give guys some concussions and things. It wasn't completely harmless, but it was obviously meant to be essentially a symbolic response. The same thing that they did when the Israelis killed the Hamas leader in Tehran in a bombing. And then they also had struck the Iranian consulate in Syria and killed important Iranian officials there. They launched that missile salvo at Israel, but they announced it beforehand and said, essentially get all of your defenses ready. This is because the Ayatollah, I'm sure it'd be terrible to live there. But he is essentially cautious in foreign policy because, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I've been saying this for a very long time. If you're the Ayatollah, what are you going to do with a problem like the USA? Right? America has an incredibly powerful Air Force, even with conventional weapons. We could obliterate Iran's cities and they couldn't do nothing to us. They couldn't sail a boat within 1,000 miles of our shores ever. Right? So what's he going to do? Just get into a brawl with Donald Trump and lose so badly when he could try to calm it down? And so what did he do? He launched an attack at an American base in Iraq, and an American base, our most important base at Qatar, CENTCOM headquarters at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And as Trump said in a tweet, thank you very much for the prior warning that you're going to launch this symbolic attack and let us, shoot it down and this kind of thing. So the Ayatollah there was telegraphing very obviously, I do not want to fight you. Please.
Yeah, and what's so important about this to think about is this completely contradicts the neocon and Israeli government position and propaganda that they've been repeating for decades, that Iran is going to just try to wipe Israel off the map, that Iran is trying to kill as many U.S. servicemen as they can in the region. But that did not happen. Even that when they were boxed into the smallest corner of smallest corners, when the U.S. was bombing them, when Israel was bombing them, and regime change seemed to be potentially on the table, they acted cautiously. They practiced restraint. And it's that restraint that made this ceasefire possible. Trump rolled the dice on American lives in the Middle East by being willing to join Netanyahu and bomb them. That was rolling the dice. So the neocons were proven so incredibly wrong about how Iran would behave. And that is really important to know because in the future, I promise you, they're going to drum up this threat again. They're going to say Iran's a threat to destroy the United States because they chant. They chant death to America. Have you heard their chants? Their chants are so vile. Oh, by the way, do they actually do attacks against Americans? Except for a few times on American forces that were in the Middle East under other war operations? No, they don't. And I'm not saying that's good. I don't justify their strikes against Americans, which they've done when Americans were in Iraq and some other places like that. But I don't want the U.S. involved. And again, the solution to all that is stop being entangled in the Middle East. Get all of our forces out of there. Don't have a CENTCOM headquarters in Qatar. Stop empire building and focusing operational warfare in the Middle East. It's nonsensical. So Scott's so right about this. I'm so glad he's highlighting the cautious nature of the Iranians, which is necessary from their standpoint to preserve their regime. It's self-sovereignty. It's self-preservation, the manner in which they were acting. It wasn't genocidal freaks like the Israelis and neocons tried to assert.
Let's call this off. So,
Yeah. It's almost like
what he's going to do now, and
rational
he's an old man
actors.
too. He could drop dead tomorrow.
Yeah. It's almost like they're rational actors and not the end time psychopaths that we've been sold on who are ready to nuke Kansas the moment that they have the opportunity, or Tel Aviv for that matter. Let's talk a little bit about the other nation state involved in this conflict. That would be Israel. Guys, if you could put C5 up on the screen, this is, the axis between the American neocons and also the Israelis. So you've got Mark Levin here praising Netanyahu for his new speech, saying Israelis have never been more united. The Arab world has never been more appreciative. Netanyahu is a truly remarkable leader, and this is with regards to speech.
Just imagine that. The Arab world has never been more appreciative of what happened here. I can't even believe it, even if you're a neocon like Levin saying that. They've never been more appreciative of what's happened. The entire Arab world has basically turned against Israel and the United States in almost every way, with very few exceptions. With Syria to a small exception, Egypt to a small exception, and that's just because the U.S. pays them off to the tune of, I think, $1.5 billion a year or something like that. And that is probably tenuous. The Arab world has never been more appreciative. I can't imagine this, especially in light of what's going on in Gaza. World opinion has turned against Israel over this, and over Gaza, and over Israel's behavior the last few decades, going to war with so many of its neighbors, even 5 or 6 of them since October 11th or October 7th. They've gotten involved in, bombing Yemen, laying claims to, I think, parts of Syria, parts of Lebanon, what's going on in Gaza, and then they attacked Iran. The Arab world has never been more appreciative. I can't get over that.
Where Netanyahu says we must complete the campaign against the Iranian axis, defeat Hamas, bring about the release of all of our hostages. And he says in there as well, we have no intention of taking our foot off the gas. We must complete the campaign against the Iranian axis. At the same time, guys, if you could put C3B up on the screen, this was a truth from Trump, which I will spare you reading all of this way too long thing. But in essence here, he is praising Bibi Netanyahu lavishly and calling for the corruption charges, which he's been facing inside of Israel, to be dropped. He says he's been going through this horror show with regard to these corruption charges since May of 2020. Unheard of. This is the first time a sitting Israeli prime minister has ever been on trial, and calls him.
Well, maybe it's because he's a duplicitous fraud. Because he is, beyond being a war criminal, which, by the way, he'll never face justice for being a war criminal, by the way, in Gaza, enacting a genocide that's killed between 50 to 100,000 people, a lot of which are innocent, by the way. Thousands of innocent women and children have died there. Hamas is completely dismantled. There's maybe, if you're doing liberal estimates, about 13,000 of those left, Hamas members. Rockets don't go into Israel anymore. They've stopped. They're a beaten populace. They're a completely subjugated populace with few rights, and they're being subjugated and coerced by the Israeli government in the worst type of warfare imaginable, where we've seen the children plucked up from the rubble. It's heartbreaking. And he's going to do this message after Netanyahu undermined his own stated foreign policy goals to negotiate with the Iranians. They drew the United States into that, sabotaged the negotiations, and then bombed Iran. And this is what he says about Iran's prime minister. This is so bogus.
Politically motivated. So in any case, what do you make of how the Israelis are assessing this moment? And, what do you think is going on here with this Trump truth in praise of Netanyahu?
Well, I think everything's coming up Likud, right? I mean, they have been, largely successful in the annihilation of the society of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The settlers are on the move, expanding in the West Bank. They've taken all the territory up to the Litani River in southern Lebanon and taken a major chunk out of Syria. They've completed, with the help of the Turks, the al-Qaeda revolution and takeover of Syria and the end of the Ba'athist regime there, which was led by Alawites who were close to the Shiites and close to Iran. They through the pager attack and aerial attacks, they have severely crippled Hezbollah as well as killed their leader, Nasrallah. They got America to come in and help them to severely cripple, at the very least, Iran's nuclear program. We don't know exactly, as we've been talking about, how that's going to play out, what the consequences of that'll be. They still have the Houthis, and the Houthis are hard to kill. Barack Obama and Donald Trump already tried to kill them, and Joe Biden a little bit for about 8 years there.
And Trump for about a month, until ballistic missiles were being depreciated there, and it really seemed fruitless because the Houthis fought about a decade-long civil war that was partially a ground war with Saudi Arabia, and they came out victorious. Saudi Arabia retreated and stopped trying to do that. There's still a blockade there, but the Houthis are not easy to kill, as Scott is saying, and it was such a disaster for the U.S. ever to get involved there during the Obama years especially, and he did that to placate the Saudis. But yeah, Scott's right.
And didn't win anything. All they did was, war's the health of the state unless you lose. And in this case, they didn't lose. And so the people of Yemen are more united around their government now than probably ever before, under, what the academics call the rally around the flag effect. I know a reporter that I interviewed years ago, or I interviewed him a ton of times, Nasser Arabi from Sana'a, said, "Oh, we're all Houthis now." Not that they are, but the same way Americans supported George W. Bush. Somebody attacks us, then it's us versus you, if that's how it is. And as he put it to me, he said, well, George Bush is from Texas, right? But when he's the president of the country, he's not just a Texan, he's the president of the country, and he's respected as such by the people of the whole country, not just the Texans, of course. So it's the same thing when the Shiites from the Sada province are in charge. You attack the country, you attack the country.
That's what we're seeing in Iran, too. All the indications are that these people did not want to rise up and overthrow their own government when the U.S. and Israel attacked. They wanted to be solidified behind their leader because of that patriotic cause, in their eyes, is supporting their country against aggression. So that's another reason why this Iran strike was counterintuitive, and the same reason that the strikes against Yemen were counterintuitive. You're not going to get this internal regime change off of attacks by other enemies, and the biggest bullies on the block, actually, in the form of the United States and Israel.
And, now there are splits, and in the South they have the STC and all that, but overall the Houthis have proven to be a very difficult target to take out from the air. And who's going to send in ground troops there? And this goes back to our hypothetical about Iran, which I sort of trailed off instead of wrapping up, that if they decide to double down on their nuclear program, then we go back to what Netanyahu said the other day, which is, what would solve this problem permanently? Killing the Ayatollah and having a regime change there one way or the other, which they may even be able to accomplish by air if they have real intelligence. Trump threatened, I know exactly where you are. I could kill you right now if I wanted to, the other day, a week ago. And so by their logic, if they're right, if even the guys, Mark Dubowitz from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies was saying, well, now that Israel started this war, America better go in there with their big bunker busters and fish it, or else now they're going to break out toward a nuke. Exactly. Well, they still might now try to break out toward a nuke.
This is why the war propaganda is going to stay alive forever. It's going to be cyclical. They're going to talk regime change again. And that's what sickens me. That's why I think this mission, though far better than the worst case scenario, is an ultimate failure. If your goal was really to curtail their nuclear program, they're only inspired to do that, to, cause dissension within Iran such that maybe there's an internal regime change. No, it seems like public sentiment is, galvanized in support of this regime. And it betrays the negotiations that were happening and sows the seeds of distrust throughout the world. What does Russia and Putin think about this? They're not going to want to negotiate with the United States over Ukraine. Are you kidding me? This was so wrong-headed in so many ways.
In which case, the logic is that the problem isn't solved yet. We got to keep killing mullahs until the problem is solved, until we can parachute in a monarch, or we'll have Al-Qaeda in Iraq take over in Iran too, since they've done such a great job in Syria for us.
Listen, Donald Trump literally shaking the guy's hand, and shaking the guy's hand. It's unbelievable.
He has
Scott,
a very strong past, Trump said. Look it up. He told Frontline, he's like, yeah, I killed American soldiers in Mosul and Ramadi. That's the strong past that Trump's referring to.
Right.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Jelani, who's also known as al-Shara, the new leader of Syria, has literal ties to al-Qaeda. He fought against U.S. forces in Iraq as part of al-Qaeda. He fought for U.S. forces in Syria as part of al-Qaeda. Think about that for a second. John McCain flew over there to shake the hands of the al-Qaeda-linked fighters over there, and now he's the leader of Syria. And Trump met him, shook his hand, treated him like any other, world leader, and said he had a strong past. Just think of that. That is the product of U.S. entangling alliances across the world. And this isn't the first case. There's been many times in which the U.S. has supported factions and rebel groups that eventually become their enemy, and vice versa, then become their friend. The U.S. supported Saddam Hussein in the 1980s in his war against Iran. It killed about 1 million Iranians. And then he's overthrowing that regime, and we spent about 40 years of my lifetime somehow involved in Iraq. Same thing is true to some extent when it comes to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who fought the Soviets, who contained a lot of rebel fighters that did split off into various factions, some of which formed the Northern Alliance that fought against the Taliban, some of which formed the Taliban, and some of which formed terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. That is the dynamics we get when we get involved in these entangling alliances. They always bite the U.S. in the back in the end.
But we got to take out the Ayatollah because American soldiers were.
And this goes the whole thing. Yeah. Israel's enemies are the Shiites. But it was not Hezbollah that knocked our towers down. I'm sorry I'm such a broken record on this, but this is all treason because the Likud hates Iran.
Right.
But America could have normalized relations with Iran back in the 1990s. Hell, Ronald Reagan was selling them missiles in the mid-1980s. After Beirut, within a couple of years, he's selling them missiles. Zbigniew Brzezinski and Alexander Haig wanted to normalize relations in 1993. The Ayatollah came begging George W. Bush to get along with the Golden Offer in 2002. So you guys hate the Taliban, you guys hate Saddam Hussein, you guys hate Al-Qaeda, let's work together.
Yeah.
And the neoconservatives said no, because Israel hates the Shiites more.
Scott,
and somehow
Exactly. Israel guided our mentality, our country's mentality toward Iran for these last few decades, and there were many chances to normalize it. I'll give Obama credit even for normalizing it under the JCPOA from 2015 to 2018. Well, that was shredded. Why? Israel hated it. Israel disliked it. Hezbollah didn't knock down our towers, as Scott said. Al-Qaeda did. So if you want to support your country, if you really believe in America first, it's not Israel first. They're not synonymous in this regard. Israel can have Hezbollah and Hamas as their enemy and deal with them as they like, if you're asking me. Just keep my country out of it. Keep my country's treasury out of it. Keep my country's soldiers out of it. Keep my country's propaganda out of it for good.
That matters more than who hit the Pentagon.
Let me ask you one last question here, which is the Iranians are, trying to claim and assert some sort of victory and project that they effectively were able to affect enough damage inside of Israel that Israel felt the need to accept this ceasefire, and there was reporting about Israel running low on interceptors. And I think the other way they're claiming victory is basically you all wanted to destroy us and collapse the government, and the government is still here, and our nation is still here. So what do you make of, their sort of celebration and their claiming of a victory in these circumstances?
Well, in the first case there may be some truth to that they still have missiles in reserve, and Israel's running out of Sparrows and Iron Domes and Patriots and whatever that they had to shoot them down with. There may be some truth to that. I'm sure there was some pressure on the Israelis on their side of it.
Yeah, Mearsheimer said they weren't ready to fight a war of attrition and that Israel actually sought the ceasefire. It's believable if that's the case, but also I know the political circumstances are such that Netanyahu wanted regime change there more than anything, and he might have thought that this is our only chance. So he might have been torn in that, but it's interesting to see the different mentalities on that and the military versus political considerations there.
Because a lot more missiles did get through than they thought. As far as the second part, I think that's sort of propaganda, trying to portray a little bit of a position of strength there. domestically trying to save a little bit of face there. But I think it was Donald Trump that said, we're calling a halt here short of regime change. I think if he had given Netanyahu permission to keep going, or had shared the intelligence, this is where we think the Ayatollah is, go ahead and get him, then they absolutely could go that far. Anybody could probably just picture, just from memory, B-52s over North Vietnam, just what they call carpet bombing, just pouring dumb bombs out of the belly of those gigantic heavy bomber planes that we have. And there's pictures, people have seen profile pictures of B-2s doing the same, but the B-52s especially, America could really devastate. It was credible when he ordered, Donald Trump, don't forget, ordered the evacuation of Tehran.
Yeah.
And the implication, was like, geez, I don't think he's going to nuke them, but what is he going to do? Like, what is even the implication there?
Yeah, and there's 9 million people in Tehran, 10 million? That's an incredible decision to make. And I think 14 million in Tehran plus the outskirts. So, this meddled with a lot of lives. Think about all the people placed into horror over this when the United States is telling Tehran to evacuate. That is considerable. That takes a human toll beyond what, most people are talking about in regard to this. And I really do think regime change was on the table. I do think that would have been sold by the Trump administration if Iran would have struck at U.S. forces hard. They killed a few hundred. That would be all the impetus that you would need to sell this war, the same kind of war that the U.S. got bogged down in for 20 plus years in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And it turned out the implication, which was the most minimal one, was just, he was going to encourage the Israelis to keep hitting government targets in that city. They weren't going for terror bombing of the neighborhoods on the vast scale that they could. But boy, even that threat sure sounded like it and was going very far here. So I would expect for the population and the political establishment inside Iran to be more radicalized and more defiant than ever. It's only natural, really, unless the Ayatollah just slams his fist down, says, no, I'm in charge here. And I say, boy, we better be conciliatory now because of our position of weakness, which I think is doubtful, right?
Totally agree. This is the worst ramification of it. It did everything to the contrary of what the stated aims were. To stir rebellion or to, dismantle the nuclear weapons program, to, cause a schism between the people and the government, and, to prove that the U.S. can get a successful strike done. That doesn't even seem to be the case. So in every way, I think this was a failure. Again, was this the worst case scenario? No, it wasn't.
But that's what it would take. Yeah. It would take him shouting at everybody else to shut up. I'm the one deciding, and I've decided that we're going to have to play a little bit meek in the face of this madman or whatever. But I don't know how anyone could fairly expect that to be the result of this, quite frankly.
We'll see.
Yeah, totally agree. This strike was not in the interest of the American people, that's for sure. And I think, again, you're going to see this bubble up in other forms throughout the years. If not under this presidency, under another one. I'd like to hope the most optimistic, part of me believes that Trump won't revisit this madness again, that he didn't want regime change there. He did at least take the off-ramp at the end, even though regime change was on the table. He even tweeted about it. That was a huge mistake, too. And that this won't be revisited again, at least by the U.S. under his term. Now, we have to hope for the next time when the neocons clamor for this regime change, as they've always wanted, and Netanyahu cheers for this regime change, which he's always wanted. We have a U.S. president that also is not willing to go that full bore and do whatever Israel wants in the end game, in the last resort, and that's the overthrow of Khomeini. And man, it doesn't bode well for future relations with other countries. I touched upon it a little in this video, but if you're the world, you were watching what happened here. You were watching these negotiations supposedly break down, and I guess they did break down because the U.S. switched their demands of Iran. Iran continued the same, stance that we want to negotiate with the United States, and there's proof to suggest that because they did that in 2015. They wanted to be under a normalized relationship with the United States, probably under self-preservation, but they were complying with the inspection regime that was set up under that arrangement. That got torn up. now they're incentivized to pursue a nuke, and I would be too. I'd fast track it. I wouldn't negotiate with the United States. I still hope they negotiate with the United States despite all this craziness and madness, but I don't think that's possible. Scott alluded to the fact that there was negotiations that were going to happen again in a week, and that really surprised me, but I don't know if he was specifically talking about negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, because Trump seemed to kind of, throw that idea to the wayside when he said, I think we destroyed it all. I don't even think we need to negotiate anymore. But that's pretty convenient, especially if they did get a lot of that uranium out. But I do want to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. How do you think this affects the Middle East in general, U.S. relationship with Israel? Do you think it will be stronger or more distant after this? How do you think this affects the war propaganda and the calls for regime change in Iran? And was this counterintuitive or an actual success as the Trump administration is trying to sell? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Breaking Point's great podcast there, and please consider becoming a YouTube member or Patreon patron to support my channel. I'd graciously appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.